My name is Aaron Jacobs. I work at Posit on our sort of professional commercial products. I'm going to talk today about something sort of thematic that we've changed about our pro products. When I submitted this talk, when I was working on this way, sort of December, I thought that maybe no one had heard of any of these features and that few people outside of the company or even the team that I was working with would know about this stuff at all. This week, it has been very surprising because not only do people keep asking me about this, but we now have a ton of demos in the lounge, and James mentioned this stuff in the keynote. Like all that was news to me. I think that this work has accelerated incredibly quickly. And because of that, I think today I'm going to actually talk more about like the strategy, I think, and the ideas behind it and sort of what influence like our thinking about these problems, as opposed to sort of walking through specific features. And hopefully that is interesting. So I think this is a pretty mixed audience, is my guess. Can I see a show of hands for people who have actually used Workbench? Well, that's so many more than I was expecting. Awesome. Okay, so if you are not in that crowd, have you used RStudio? Like most people, okay. So I think that a lot of people who are familiar with RStudio think about Workbench as like the pro version of RStudio. Especially because actually Workbench was called RStudio Server Pro for like the first couple of years that existed. But I don't think this is a terribly accurate view anymore, not the least because Workbench now supports 4 data science IDEs, and as you learned this morning, pretty soon 5. But in our own words, we would describe Workbench as, this is what our website says, a secure and scalable developer platform for data science in R and Python. The way that I generally think about Workbench is like as a centralized hosting for data science IDEs. And it includes a ton of features that are geared towards folks that are working in enterprise. So that includes things like SSO support, admin managed R and Python environments, resource controls, auditing, monitoring, a form of project sharing, and more. So more broadly than Workbench, I think I would describe our professional products as devoted to making code-first data science successful inside of organizations. One of the things I talked about in the keynote this morning is that we do tend to draw the line between our open source and professional work in that way. The focus of our professional products is very much on organizations, and that tends to be the dividing line. But one thing that they didn't talk about very much today is the problems that you tend to encounter in enterprises are often fundamentally uninteresting or surprising if you're a pure open source user. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about that today. So what does it mean to be successful inside of organizations? I mean, the truth is that we are also constantly trying to figure that out. That's the process of making a commercial product for customers. You have to try and figure out what they actually want. And if we know one thing is that the meaning of that has not stayed constant over time. So it's readily apparent to us that the capabilities that drove customers to purchase RStudio Server Pro in 2014 when we released it are not the same things that drive them to purchase Posit Workbench in 2024. What our customers and users need out of our professional products is actually changing over time. And what I want to focus on today, one way of thinking about it is that it's one of the important ways that we have observed that data science inside of organizations is changing, and the ways that our professional products are kind of adapting in response. Right. So, if any of you remember, if you think back to when you were new to data science, I'm sure plenty of pedagogical material gave you this idea that all data science would begin and end with tidy, self-contained CSV or maybe Parquet files that were just waiting to be analyzed. So I like to describe that as like the download the training data and get started. Like that's the worldview there. And I think as most of you probably know, the reality is much more complicated. So a key part of data science work is just confronting the fact that data is messy and inconclusive and incomplete. Its provenance is unclear. Its value is often unclear. And plenty of folks, I think, at this conference will have something to say about this problem. But I want to focus on a second very unglamorous reality of data science work inside of organizations, which is that getting access to data at all can be a struggle. So I think for much of Posit's early history, we mostly saw enterprise customers manage access to data, if they were doing so at all, via Windows file shares and on-prem database management systems like Oracle, SQL Server. And over time, actually, our enterprise products ended up working reasonably well in this context. But I think over the last 5 years or so, because everything is slow in enterprise, we've seen a pretty dramatic shift among our customers to the cloud. Surprise. And a lot of the fairly simple access control mechanisms that we were accustomed to and the credential paradigms that we used that worked in this on-prem context have not served folks well in this brave new cloud world. So to give a hopefully humorous example of this, suppose your team inside of your organization is tasked with analyzing customer churn. So classic problem, right? So when you get started on this project, you know that your company stores basic customer data in Salesforce. So you know you'll eventually probably want to access it by Salesforce's API. It turns out that this means asking your IT department to register a Salesforce external app for you, which takes a few weeks. And when it comes back, that comes back with a warning not to embed the OAuth client credentials in scripts or reports, whatever that means. And next, you want to understand how your customers' experience in your web app might have influenced their desire to churn. To get that data, you might actually need to ask a friend on the development team because you want them to want to run a query against a production database, which is in, say, AWS Aurora, because the activity data that you actually need hasn't yet been persisted to the internal data lake. The internal data lake uses Azure SQL Server, as it turns out, because in the year that project started, Microsoft gave you more cloud credits than Amazon. And then meanwhile, the CIO is saying everything's going to move to Snowflake starting in the fall, but they've been saying that for 3 years, and you don't really know if that's still a real thing at all. And if you're counting, this is 3 different SQL dialects you need to know at this point. Meanwhile, you've heard that one of the other departments has been playing with Databricks or Spark and Databricks, and it seems like maybe you could get access to cool streaming data there to make a nice dashboard. But they're hesitant to give you access because they want to make sure that the compute costs for your project don't get attributed to their department. Then you discover through Salesforce that some important aspects of customer information are actually only available in the original invoices, which are PDFs stored in an AWS S3 bucket. And they're in an S3 bucket because that was what was used as an internal tool that is currently unmaintained, but is critical for the success of the sales organization. And then it turns out that it's not the same AWS account that you normally use, but it's actually a different one. And that one by policy does not allow you to use IAM user credentials. And now you have to figure out how to get IAM role assumption working. And then to top all of it off, customer success only tracks their meetings in a Google spreadsheet, which has cross-references to Google Docs with their notes from those calls, which are the only place where you could find a textual source that might actually contain hints as to why those customers churned, and for which you need a GCP service account to access, which is just terrible. And so on and so on and so on. So hopefully some of you find this amusing. Some of you, it may trigger PTSD. It certainly does for me. And I think that this is an exaggeration, but having talked to a reasonable number of customers, I think it is only a slight exaggeration. No, I missed this, sorry. So I think that the common themes that we hear today when we're talking about the challenges of getting access to data inside of organizations would be complexity. So although there's a limited number of cloud or data platforms, so this is essentially AWS, Azure, GCP, Snowflake, and Databricks, those are kind of, from our vantage point, the biggest ones that we see. Many customers are using more than one. Many customers are actually using all of them together. And everyone seems to be in the middle of a years-long migration to an internal data platform that is yet to materialize. And so you are even more likely to be pulling data from multiple places in the same projects. The second thing that we see is new forms of authentication and authorization. The native language of these cloud platforms is IAM and OAuth, not usernames and passwords. And the third major theme we see is more scrutiny, I would say, about the use of credentials. So when I worked as a data scientist, the entire department, actually the entire company, shared a single database account and password. This would be considered wildly, actually it was wildly insecure even at the time, but it would be wildly inappropriate today. IT folks are increasingly unhappy with data scientists managing long-lived credentials themselves. They really do not want you to embed your personal Snowflake username and password inside of a quarter report, which is absolutely the formal guidance that Snowflake sent me via email and PDF a year ago. This is not an obscure solution. Not only have the technologies changed, the expectations have changed as well. And actually, something a coworker reminded me of this morning, there was a big data breach at Snowflake about 6 weeks ago. It was caused because someone was using a service account that they did not use single sign-on with, unsurprisingly, because it's a service account, so you can't do single sign-on correctly. Anyway, I think that something that Posit has always valued, both on the open source and open source side and in its professional products, is meeting people where they are, helping data scientists be heroes inside of their organizations. And right now, we think that an increasing amount of heroism is coming from the ability of our users to navigate these complex data platforms. So with that in mind, I think beginning about 2 years ago, we started building deep integrations into Workbench about 2 years ago to manage data and cloud platform credentials for you. And today, as of the Workbench release this week, I hope it's this week, that includes managed credentials for AWS, for Azure, for Databricks, and Snowflake. This is one of the modals. There's various UI around it. So what this means in practice, because you're all nerds here, is that we've taught Workbench to speak these new languages like IAM and OAuth. The idea is that when you arrive in an IDE like RStudio, all of the credentials you need to access your organization's data are already present quietly in the background. You don't need to manage an AWS access key. You don't need to manage a Databricks personal access token. You don't need a Snowflake service account. You don't, as a data scientist, need to do this work yourself. This makes not only you happy, but it also makes your admin and hopefully IT folks very happy as well. Now, on the subject of being nerdy, you may be interested to know that the way this works under the hood is that Workbench will manage configurations files and environment variables for you. We will do things like run through this OAuth stuff. We will refresh tokens for you. We will generate these configuration files. And we've been very, very careful to make this as compatible with the existing tools as possible. So you'll find things like the AWS CLI just like works in RStudio. You'll find that the Databricks SDKs just work inside of Visual Studio Code in Python. The Snowflake CLI works. Like an amazing percentage of this work was actually just very carefully reading the public source code of these SDKs and figuring out how they worked, figuring out how they manage credentials and teaching Workbench to operate in that paradigm. And something actually Edgar talked about a little bit today is that we then took a lot of what we had learned by looking particularly at the Python ecosystem and then ported some of those credential paradigms to R, largely through the ODBC package, but also through other mechanisms. So I would say, what's next generally for us for managed credentials? So I said we currently support 4 major providers. Some of those have sort of paper cuts that we would like to improve. I think that'll certainly happen for AWS and Azure. But one of the things that happened as a result of this project is that introducing some of these capabilities into Workbench changed how we thought about what Workbench could do as a project or could do as a product. And so a good illustration of this is Workbench has supported this idea of ad hoc jobs for a while, but it was not clear really what the advantage of using that feature over just running R in a terminal would be. But with managed credentials, we actually have a really nice answer to that, which is that this allows jobs to use credentials. So you can have something like you can be working on a project and you need to run a simulation that takes 6 hours. So you run it overnight and it uses some Databricks data. And right now we wouldn't really have had an answer to that. But with managed credentials, you can do things like, this job is going to run for 6 hours and 5 hours in, it needs to pull some new data from Databricks, but Workbench will have refreshed the credential for you. So it'll work. It also allows us to tackle, problems we've had for a long time and we didn't know how to solve, like how do we answer this, paper cut issues around how people use Git inside of Workbench. It's very painful to manage SSH keys. We don't have a great OAuth story. Hey, wait, no, we have a great OAuth story now. Can we make that work? And all of this to say, I think that I'm very excited about the direction this sort of means for the project and the sort of future of it. The last thing I'll say is we have not forgot about publishing. So it's not enough just to have a great authoring experience. We know that these cloud credentials are now vitally important for the kind of data products people are producing, reports, emails, dashboards, wonderful, shiny and shiny for Python applications, Streamlit apps, Viola apps. The diversity is wide. And I think that definitely when I was preparing this talk, there was nothing to say about this. But as of last week, Connect has publicly released its first round of support for these integrations as well. And now I'm even more hopeful about this future because we can probably tell a great story where you can move from working on data science projects that use all of these new cloud credential systems to having a seamless publishing workflow that picks up on these credentials. James mentioned this morning in his keynote that also there's some very cool aspects of this Connect integration for viewer-based permissions. So I would say, okay, so that's it. I can answer a question. I will say, definitely it's the case that you should drop by. If you're interested in this at all, drop by the lounge. I think like the 8 people in the world who I can pick to talk about that are basically all here, including most of the engineers who work with me on these projects across both products, and also solution engineers who give better demos than I could ever aspire to in my life. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And as a solutions engineer, I'll say some of our demos aren't quite as good as maybe you'd like to think they are.
You know, I got to say, I've had the experience of watching a solution engineer give a demo for a feature that I wrote and being like, wow, you did a much better job than I did. So you guys are great. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So a couple of questions. Well, this isn't a question. This is just an explanation. GitHub credentials. Yes, please.
Yeah, actually. Yeah. Yes. We'll see. We'll see. I have to argue with Tom Ock, who's the product manager, about feature spots for Workbench. But yes.
Okay. And I guess, it's not a mech question, but also, there's GitLab and Bitbucket and yeah.
It all works in demo.
Okay.
Sorry. No, I won't say that, but yeah. Anyway. It's on our mind.
Is this solution, okay. That's always good to know. Is this solution also available in the free RStudio download?
So no, because it's arguable that it doesn't really make sense, because if you're operating on desktop, a lot of this OAuth stuff like works through a browser flow and typically uses like localhost redirect. Like all of those workflows already kind of work. The place that they're really painful is on server environments. And in particular, the main difference is if you're working on desktop, you want to be managing stuff yourself because like you're operating as an individual. But one of the main benefits for Workbench, which is a trade-off, right, is that you're moving to a more admin-controlled environment. And that is a trade-off, right? Like there are definitely uncomfortable aspects of not working on your desktop. So I think about this as being like, yeah, anyway. So I think that I could say more about this. There's various technical and also social reasons why it doesn't really make sense for those features to be available in the open source version. And this is actually an illustration of that point I tried to clumsily make at the beginning, which is I think we sometimes think about like, could we not just put enterprise features in our open source products? But I think a lot of the time they're not as portable as you think they are, and often they rely on assumptions that are not possible in an open source context, or are fundamentally uninteresting in many cases to open source users. So I would say no, these things are not coming to our open source products. Though we did like the ODBC, the ODBC work, for example, like that's all open source. That all also benefits open source users. So.
Okay, thank you. Are these Auth integrations only the RStudio IDE?
Haha. Yeah. No, they are not. They already work in VS Code. Of course, we made them work in VS Code because we knew that Positron was coming. So they will work on. They'll work on launch when Positron comes to Workbench, which is hopefully in the fall. And also, we intend to port them to JupyterLab. Don't get me started on how difficult that is, but we'll do that too.
I'll ask you that off stage. Can SAML or ODIC connections be latently asserted by Workbench?
Can be latently asserted by Workbench. I don't actually know what that means. I would say there's already machinery in Workbench to do clever things with OIDC. That's how the AWS integration works. Don't get me started on SAML and how it lacks a refresh protocol and how that makes everything terrible. If you're really interested in that, come find me after, and I maybe can answer your question.
Poor Aaron's going to be like fighting off the crowd. Are these integrations only for individual Salesforce, Databricks user accounts, or can you use a service account?
So they are focused on the IDE user. So I think there's a larger theme, which is that these platforms are increasingly moving away from things like service accounts. So I don't know, like if you go to the Databricks page, they're like, please do not use personal access tokens anymore. Please use Auth. You go to the Snowflake page, it says, please do not use service accounts. You go to the IAM user page on AWS's documentation, it's like, please do not use this. Please use short-lived session credentials. So I think that we're going in this direction of like short-lived, individually kind of like attributed credentials. That said, these systems basically can all be sort of like individually turned off when needed. So you can make all existing patterns work. Like we don't close the door on using other methods.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you to the rest of the speakers.
I would also say, I would say, like, don't get the impression that I did all of this work myself.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things about a lot of it, these conference talks, is like, you're talking about open source work that you've done, and it's like work that you have individually done. So many people internally at Posit and also externally contributed to these features, and they were done over the course of 2 years. So, as you imagine.
All right. Well.
Yeah. All right. I'm giving up the stage.
Yeah.